So yeah, afternoon everyone, good to be here. My name's Talal, and I'm going to take you through a somewhat personal and retrospective look at what we've been up to at Etihad for the past 3 years. I want to start with a story, and I'm going to start somewhere in the middle of our journey. I'm going to take you back to around September of 2020, right around after the first COVID peak. Now, for those of you in the audience, it wasn't that long ago, and I'm sure you remember what it was like. In case anyone is watching this in the distant future, hopefully COVID is a distant memory and you actually need some context, I'll set the scene. Massive uncertainty, a lot of us working from home for the first time, flights being grounded, projects being shelved, naturally manpower cuts, support being stretched thin. And it's right around this time that I assume responsibility for a tight data science team at Etihad. And with that, I inherited more than a few responsibilities and challenges. You see, it had now been just about 18 months, coming up on 2 years since this vision had started, since the idea of an in-house advanced analytics team with data science skills would be used to build prototypes that could eventually generate revenue, mitigate risk, reduce costs, and so on. So what I'm about to tell you today is really just the lessons that I've gone through since then, and over time you'll see this timeline fills out. And yeah, I hope that it's something that's beneficial to you. I've noticed, especially in the region, there's a lot of, especially semi-government and local players who are starting to build out data science teams, starting to revamp their existing data practices. So hopefully the lessons that I've learned, honestly, they're for me first and foremost, because I want to practice what I preach, and then hopefully they're beneficial to you as well. I'll do this super quick. I studied operations research, but I'm a wannabe computer scientist at heart. I've been doing data science around 10 years across multiple disciplines, a little bit in academia, consulting, and most recently in aviation, which is really another way of saying I've had my ups and downs, as I think every data scientist has. I think really it warrants its own talk to talk about kind of self-doubt and challenges in data science, because it's a very technical field. It's always growing, and even when you're delivering great work, sometimes you're like, oh man, I'm not good enough. There's all this amazing stuff out there. But since then, fortunately, I've emerged honestly with a strong feeling of a strong desire to build data science teams, to make data science products work, and to foster an environment that allows that. And I'm hoping to continue that process. And yes, so as I mentioned today, I lead a tight, primarily remote team. So I'm based in HQ in Abu Dhabi, but my team is actually in Belgrade, Serbia, out of an enterprise analytics department, and I'll explain a little more why that's relevant, is that we're not in the IT function. We serve as sort of a bridge between the business and IT, which we call DTI. And since I took too long to talk about myself, here's a pug tax. This is my spirit animal. It's a pug with glasses. So I'm going to start with a phase of our journey that I call the proofs of concept phase, the POC phase, if you will. And this was an exciting time for us. We had initiated several projects across the company. See, our remit as enterprise analytics was more or less the whole org. So we had projects in fuel optimization, in manpower planning, in marketing. We were building these POCs. We were estimating our benefits, trying to pitch to our customers. And our team even grew. So everything felt like it was going swimmingly. And so lesson one comes now, in retrospect, comes from that period. The lesson is, and much like many other people have said, you really need to put people first. Center the stakeholder throughout your data science project lifecycle. It's really key to make sure you're understanding and solving a problem, not just trying to understand and put out a solution, right? Now, I'll talk a little bit about our original approach. You'd field an idea from the business. You'd scope it out with them. You'd work towards building a proof of concept, right, which involves your exploratory data analysis, multiple rounds with the customer, trying different models, and so on, until you think, okay, I've now got a proof of concept that's pretty good. We would then use that proof of concept to derive a benefit estimate. So let's say you have a conversion rate model or a model that optimizes what kind of campaign you should send different users. And you say, all right, well, here's your baseline email open rate. Our model, we believe, will increase it by 10%, which should translate into this much more revenue. Package that up into a nice deck, and voila, you now have your business case to take to your customer. If that goes well, great. You are off to the races. You begin your MVP development. I think sounds pretty reasonable, and it's a pretty common approach, I think. But naturally, issues arise in many of these steps. First off, very often the way we were working is we were working off of ideas based on convenience, rather than taking a more methodical approach to prioritizing which projects should we be starting with first. When we were doing EDA, I honestly think in hindsight, at the risk of kind of throwing ourselves under the bus, we were doing it too much in service of the solution and not enough in service of the problem. There's a really great PyData talk by someone named Vincent Varmadam called The Science of Solving the Wrong Problem. And it's linked in the slides, which should probably be shared later. I think it's really important to make sure you're actually trying to solve the problem, and in doing so, have a sufficient focus about the end-to-end, and not just like, oh, my deliverable is a POC, and I'm just going to think about getting out my model, et cetera. Even with doing the benefit estimate part, again, it makes a lot of sense. You have to do it, right? You want to turn your MSE, your accuracy rate, into some business number. How much are they going to make? How much time are they going to save? But if you haven't done any of that up front, you're going to invite so much analysis creep in many cases. Those two things together, what we found often was happening was we were taking way too long to get to the business with a final proposal. And by then, in many cases, their attention has shifted. The marketing department is now focused on some other type of campaign, and they don't need your churn model. Manpower planning has went and done an RFP without you even knowing because for whatever reason, right? And then, okay, let's say, no, you got a good stakeholder, you found someone who's an innovative partner that you can work with. Now they're incredibly demanding, and you're like, okay, just turn that POC into an MVP. There's actually no change. You've just plugged it in and out. And we've made those mistakes over time, but we're always trying to improve. And so I think I've already touched on it's maybe obvious what some of the solutions are, but first off, for prioritization, again, it's centering the stakeholder. So agree with the stakeholders early on, what's the potential value of an MVP? Can you then decide how much effort and feasibility there is? And then for each of those projects, you weight your value by your effort, and boom, you now have a stack that you can pop from the top of, and that's your backlog. Or that's your, that's the work that's a sorted backlog. EDA I've already touched on, right? You really need to make sure you're understanding the problem and introducing trade-offs early on. So this is something that we've faced so many times, is eventually you get to like, oh, I have a 85% accurate model. Okay, is that good? I was just assuming it was going to be a 95% accurate model. Well, okay, maybe you can actually cover 95% of cases more accurately if you leave out these cases. Oh, but no, I wanted to cover everything. So having those trade-off conversations early on, I think, is incredibly valuable. And it helps your next step because now you've front-loaded all of that, and you can now focus on, okay, what's going to be the real benefit estimate that you can take to a senior leader? We made the mistake sometimes fixing the top three and then dropping the formal sign-off. This sounds procedural, but it's, I would say, important. Create some sort of formal accountability. And just lastly, give an MVP due time. Finish strong by planning it properly and not just saying, all right, POC, we're just renaming this as MVP now. Lesson 2 is setting your data science team's objectives ambitiously, but also realistically and adjusting as needed. So until this day in the system in Etihad, me and my team, our roles are called Prototype Development Officer, Prototype Development Manager. Already, the fact that we're being called prototype developers, already you can probably guess that, like, all right, well, what about after the prototype? So our starting team objective was actually to, our starting team objective was, we picked some sort of target, and okay, what was that target? It was the estimated benefits proposed. Again, just take a second about that wording. We were essentially in hindsight, again, it does make a lot of sense. We had to walk before we could run. So our success was measured against, in these projects, these POCs that we're creating, how much benefit do we estimate and propose? And that's our success rate. I do think it makes sense that we started that way. But as you can imagine, this made it much harder to ensure deployments succeeded. Because we were saying, yeah, we want to deploy, but what are we really measured against? Well, we just have to estimate the benefits, and it's on the business after that. And of course, you can find some business who will help you, but what about if we instead tried to actually put it on ourselves to say, all right, I'm going to deploy at least 4 projects into production. That's going to incentivize me to work with and manage these factors that are outside of our team. And I have to find ways to do that, right? You have to manage the appetite of the business and find the right, the key stakeholders, as some folks earlier just mentioned. Manage the fact that your resources, whether it's your IT partners or others, have limitations, but you can get them on board with your same goal. And then lastly, data science literacy. It's obviously each of these I'll have some thoughts on individually, but if you don't even have the objective, then you're not going to really be incentivized to do those things. All right, lesson 3 is maybe a little bit of a personal one for me as a data science manager, is that you need to define your role right. You could argue, okay, what's in a name? I just mentioned that technically I'm a prototype development manager. So I think it really does make a difference, and I'll just give a quick overview of the different roles, different hats that I've had to wear. So you have your data science manager, which is maybe the most obvious one. You build processes and structures to get the most out of your data science team. You're the person who manages projects, evangelizes with the rest of the company. You're more or less the face of that team. If you're perhaps in a more substantial structure, you have a director and so on, but that's generally what a data science manager is. And you have your data science lead, who is basically just a very strong senior data scientist, right? This is the person who can take a project end to end. And of course, again, when it's a small team, very likely those two are probably joined. Then you have your product manager, and if you're in tech, then you know exactly what a product manager is, right? This is the person who understands the users, develops a product roadmap, and is not even necessarily super technical, but knows how to work with all the right managers to understand what resources they have at hand. And then lastly, you have an engagement or change manager, right? This is your consultant, your client-facing guy or girl. And so this is the subject matter expert, or perhaps a former subject matter expert who's now moved to the analytics practice. And so when I jumped into this, I felt like I had to juggle all of these, and that can be quite a challenge. And so I wanted to share some of the lessons of how to manage that. First one I get actually from working out. There's this term called periodize and prioritize. All that's really saying is, in any given period, let's say 12 weeks, for example, try to make most of your work, maybe 80% of your work, come from only 2 of these verticals, right? You prioritize them that way, and then in the next period, you move on. And it's hard at first. You may still have to cut corners, and you'll sometimes be the bottleneck, but it is doable. So you can say, all right, after the first 2 periods, I'm not going to product manage. We have our backlog, we have our projects. I'm going to focus on being a lead for the things that are still not done, and then for POCs that are in the mature stage, I'm going to play the engagement manager. Explain to leadership the complexity of these different roles. This was a real challenge in the beginning because in my particular case, my leadership, though very senior in analytics, wasn't very as familiar with data science. And so the timelines between building reporting dashboards and building data science solutions is very different. I'm sure many of you can attest to that. And so, the fact, again, in my particular case, we don't sit within the IT function. It isn't always clear to them that, oh, you don't have a product manager from the IT side in some of these cases. You're playing that role. Oh, the customer has not provided enough support to be the change management. You're doing change management. So explaining that is really important. Otherwise, it's a recipe for burnout. And then lastly, find an accountability counterpart. What do I mean by that? I think when a separate person plays each of these roles, there's going to be a natural communication, a natural tension, which arrives at some equilibrium and some approach forward, right? So maybe I'm the manager, and there's a product manager. Product manager just wants to give the user everything. I know that I need to protect my team's time. And the engagement manager is like, well, what do I tell the business, right? But when I'm playing all 4 of those, and we would arrive at a conclusion. But when I'm playing all 4, and sorry to keep using I, but when a data science manager has to play all four, it's very hard to be objective, right? You're going to naturally lean on whatever you're good at. If you're a really technical guy, you're going to lean on being a lead. If you're a very people person, maybe you lean on the people management. Playing all four is challenging, so if you can find someone who plays some similar role, especially on the far right side, perhaps in a different vertical, and make them like a mentor or like just a friend who can check you and who can give you that accountability. I found that was very helpful. I definitely needed it in the change management department when I started getting closer to that stage. All right, so now we go a little further. Planes are starting to come up in the air, and it just so happens that we're starting to see the fruits of our labor for the past 2 years. We had our first deployment at the end of 2020, and I won't go into the details of these projects. I'll mention just one to give you some flavor of the kind of work we've done. We built a predictive model that would tell airport managers outside of Abu Dhabi, so we call these the outstations. It would tell airport managers and outstations for the next 14 days, for each flight, what does the arrival curve look like, right? How many passengers are checking in at every 30 minutes prior to the flight? And based on that, you can now decide how many counters should you be opening, right? You had flights that were basically empty, and there's counters open 4 hours in advance. And you have flights that are full, and then they don't know that, and the counters are, they're not open till like 2 hours before the flight. I'm not saying it was that dramatically wrong, but that's just for illustration. So what we did is we built a model that could predict that, and that could then add some business logic to recommend, well, here's how many counters you should open. From that, we had a few other deployments, a few other successes, and we established a rhythm. And I already mentioned we had added now this extra objective of here's how many deployments we want to hit. And again, with the resources that we have, we also started taking on more ambitious projects. So we were like, all right, there's an interest in NLP, let's build some opinion mining. Can we work with other parts of the business and other consultants to even expand our resources? Lesson 4 comes from this period here, which is embracing uncertainty and finding your planning sweet spot. Okay, show of hands, who here has ever delivered a data science project in the exact period they originally planned? We have an honest crowd. Excellent, excellent. It is so challenging, right? It is so challenging. And I think many of you have probably heard of Hofstadter's law, which says, I think, it always takes longer than you expected, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. All right, so where do we go from there? Okay, who here has ever delivered a data science output to the customer on time? Okay, actually, a very honest crowd. I was gonna expect like 1 or 2 arms, because the difference between these two questions is expectation management, right? Question 1 is like, can you perfectly predict how long it's gonna take? Whereas question 2 is, maybe you actually don't give them a deadline until you feel very confident in, okay, you have a POC and so on. And that's kind of the theme here. I like this quote from Bruce Lee, which is adapt what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is good for your own. So really what I'm gonna talk a little bit about here is some agile principles. How many people here are familiar with agile or even just the term perhaps? Okay, good. Got a good show of hands. I mean, in the end, agile is just a set of principles. One of the systems based on agile methodology is Scrum. And so loosely speaking, we've adapted a loose version of Scrum. I won't go into all of that, but Scrum is, at a team level, some Scrum advocate's gonna shoot me for selling it down. But at a team level, you have your program increment, let's say 12 weeks, broken down into sprints, let's say 2-week sprints. And then for each of those, you're gonna build out stories, right? A story is a set of related tasks that have a definition of done. That's what it is. So maybe I'm gonna clean this particular data set, could be a story. It's a little vague, but it could be, right? Or maybe better yet, I'm gonna try L2 regularized regression on this data set. Okay, that's a story, cool. And what we do early on is we estimate the sizes of these stories, right? How much effort it takes. This is where we feel like we're constantly failing, right? Like, oh yeah, this is 8 story points, which is about 2 weeks. Oh shoot, no, it took 13. No, actually it's gonna take another 3. But what I find is this is a feature, not a bug. As long as you're front-loading these underestimates, you're basically saying that I'm going to ambitiously challenge myself to keep experimenting, right? From my perspective, the only time you really need to get conservative is close to completion. And before that, you just need to manage that. That like, look, there's inherent uncertainty in data science projects, and you need to embrace it. I'll just jump down to the third one just to save time here. Agile, value-wise, in the manifesto, they prioritize working code over documentation. That's a little challenging in data science as well, right? Because it's not all, in fact, anything, data scientists are infamous for, not the best code, right? You just want the output. But I think Jupyter Notebooks, wikis, can give you the best of both, right? Just comment your code well and make sure that every time you have a story, sorry, there's a fly that seems to like me. Every time you have a story, whatever the findings of that experiment are, that's your deliverable for that story. And you've actually produced value, right? I don't think the mindset of, oh, we're constantly failing, we're not meeting our story estimates, and our burn down rate is terrible. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. And so those are just a couple of points, I think, from this slide. And of course, every now and then, you're going to have a higher up come to you and give you an ad hoc request you can't say no to, and at that point, Scrum goes out the window, and you're like, okay, let's hustle. And then finally brings us to kind of where we are today, which I'm proud to say is we're really now focusing on delivering real value. If you're someone who's like, oh yeah, my POC has been delivering real value from day one, that's amazing. But I think for many of us, there really is this walk before you can run approach. And so now we have these deployments. A big part of what I'm doing is trying to drive user adoption, measure the real value generated, and just kind of diversify from there. Lesson 5 is how can you deliver value across the data science product lifecycle and not just work towards an MVP, not just after you've deployed your MVP. So I think a few people may have touched on this before. While you're doing your exploratory data analysis, there's a good chance that if you're really trying to understand the business problem right, you are going to unearth some insights that may not have actually come out before from their own analysts or from your BI team. This is a great way to just kind of get some value out of your early work, and also to push that. You can even push that into your reporting team, right? So that becomes its own dashboard. Starting experiments is a great one. So as soon as you have some early findings or some early outputs, sometimes there's an opportunity to go to the business and say, hey, I know this is how you've been doing it. Here's an early output. If you could do this with statistical rigor and have some randomized controlled trial, some people use theirs and some people use yours, that would be amazing. But for most of us, we can't afford that. You could just do a before-after, or just give them a survey at the end and say, hey, perception, and based on your perception, which one was better, or how did it do? From that, you now will be mining for your users, right? You'll go past the primary stakeholder who you work with every day, and you actually get over to your true end users and get the real feedback. From that now, hopefully, you've developed some wins, you have a nice story to tell, and you can start to look up the ladder. And again, this is stuff that you could do hypothetically before you've deployed your POC or your MVP. So now that you've created real opportunities, you have real outcomes you can share. And if you succeed, you'll now have real deadlines. But as we've discussed, there's no better way to get your product live. And then lastly, if all that's going swimmingly, turn all that into a business pitch, right? There's a good chance those users now have requests, and you're like, oh no, scope creep. Nope, don't preempt the scope creep, and just turn it into a roadmap, turn it into a business case, and yeah, skip the pitch. They already want it, just get them to fund it for you. Lesson 6, I'm not sure how I'm doing on time here, hopefully I'm okay. Lesson 6 is just always sell yourself. A lot of these are kind of obvious, but I think it's very important. Every time there's a POC, I like to build a one slider that's at an executive level, and just what's the methodology at a very high level, and what's the real value from an executive's perspective. And over time, you build out your portfolio, right? You now have your go-to executive deck. You carry it with you everywhere. You take it even to, you try to get in on people's town halls, right? Other departments will have their monthly town halls. Get in as a guest speaker. I'm still to this day amazed at how many people have then told me, wow, this is great. I didn't even know we had a data science team. But can I get in on more of these? I think that works a lot better, but also you can use internal communication channels like your corporate newsletters, blogs. Starting a forum is great. I think some people touched on like finding the right innovators in your company, the early adopters. Get them in a room every 2 weeks or every month and just exchange ideas, talk about what you've been working on. And maybe you'll hear about those RFPs that sneak up on you. And so then you turn your limitations into an opportunity. So maybe you're like, oh, you want to do this computer vision solution that's going to volumetrically estimate the weight of cargo. That's a thing that we have a partner doing. Get in on that as, maybe get one of your data scientists to be a shadow or to support it after sales. Use that to then build in internal capabilities that you may not have had before. And so lastly, following up on that, you can't always just be relying on what you have at hand, right? Just like no man is an island, no team is an archipelago. I don't know if that's a good pun or not, but this is a build versus buy slide. A lot of build versus buy slides are more about, urgency and strategic value. I'm just going to assume that to avoid turning this matrix into a tensor, I'm just going to assume that everything here is already high value. So the question is, when should you build versus buy? I'll just start on the far right side, right? If it's a high skill level, high manpower needed, high manpower doesn't mean a ton, it just means more than what you currently have. I think partnering with consultants is a great way to do it, but again, the way to sell it is a hybrid model, I think. Make sure they have stand-ups, make sure you have someone who's in on their meetings every day, and make sure you're bringing that skill set in-house. So it's not just someone's doing it outside, they deliver to you, and that's that, as unfortunately is not uncommon with a lot of projects. That, for data science, is definitely a recipe for problems. And then on the other hand, let's say it's a lower skill level and higher manpower, and a really good example of that is data set cleaning or data annotation. Now, there are entire papers by Google Research, literally about how they curated a data set, right? So it can't be underestimated how important it is sometimes to spend or to invest in your data. I'm not just talking about like data engineering cleaning, which of course is very important, but let's say you have an NLP project. Get that data labeled. Let's say you have like a computer vision project, right? There's vendors out there now, some crowdsourced, some managed, that will help you build those data, those annotated training sets. And now you don't feel the need to go out to a vendor. There's enough tools to train those models yourself. And it ends where it started, which is put people first. It's well known, I think, certainly in the West tech markets, but I think here as well now, the data scientists' tenures tend to be a little bit shorter than average. Part of that is that it's a growing market and data scientists are still somewhat in high demand. So of course, there's always going to be, understand your market, make sure, work with HR to deal with compensation issues. But beyond that, I do think a lot can be done to retain and grow a team based on growth and the culture fit. Data scientists, more than many other professions, I think, really search for novelty. I think almost to a fault, right? Some of them can be divas and like, I want to work on machine learning. And yeah, that's maybe 10% of your job. But still, taking a bet on their ability to leverage open source, right? If you've brought in good talent, believe in their ability to learn new skills, to work on more advanced projects, and give them those opportunities, and then groom them to become well-developed and well-rounded. So make sure if they're strong coders, but they're not as good in front of the business, make sure they understand how to communicate with business context. So giving them that growth opportunity, I think, is an excellent approach. And lastly, you have to build trust, right? As you actually generate interest from the company, all of a sudden now, a lot of people are going to want your data scientist's time, and senior people will try to throw kind of ad hoc requests at you. You need to protect their time. Always listen for feedback. I think, again, I'm speaking from the kind of cushy yet somehow yet stressful semi-government world here in the region. We don't always do enough of this, but it's really important to ask for bottom-up feedback. Always reiterate your mission, right? What are you about? Are you about growing? Are you about delivering value? Whatever your message is, stay on message. And honestly, the most important thing is that every opportunity, recognize good work. And that's it. Went through a few lessons. Happy to take any questions.